Hello everybody, welcome back to this SUPboarder video where I'm going to be talking you through some of the fastest race boards on the planet. We are going to be comparing the three Starboard race boards, the Starboard Sprint, the Starboard All-Star and the new Starboard Gen R. Which board is right for you? What sort of conditions are you going to be paddling these boards in? By the end of this video, hopefully you have a very good understanding of which board maybe you should be looking at. Remember guys, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, please give it a subscription. There's loads of videos that go on there weekly and there's bound to be stuff on there that's going to help you buy the best board for you or learn the best technique. My name's Ruben and I've been lucky enough to be paddling these boards over the last few months, and my word is there a big difference between these boards. Before we get into it, a little bit of information about Starboard. If you're unaware of who Starboard are, or maybe you're getting into racing and you're starting to understand about certain board brands, Starboard are a, fair to say, fairly big player in the SUP industry, one of the biggest brands out there. They also do windsurfing, foiling, winging equipment as well, but they do make very good, fast race boards, and they have got some of the fastest racers on the world on the podiums with them. For the last few years, there's only really been two race boards to consider from Starboard, the Starboard Sprint and the Starboard All-Star. The Sprint is the out and out, flat water, faster board, or board that's going to be better for longer distance paddling. The All-Star is a board that can pretty much tackle it all, including paddling fast, but also very happy in downwind bumps and a lot choppier water conditions compared to the Sprint. But the new Gen R is a board that comes and sits in the middle between those two boards. And a lot of you are now asking, oh, should I be going towards an All-Star or a Sprint, or should I be looking towards the Gen R? And it's a very good question to ask. Before we used the Gen R and got our own verdict on it, we did know that Starboard were pushing the Gen R towards a more of a technical surf race environment. So what that is racing out through the surf. This would involve jumping on your board, doing a beach start, paddling out over broken waves, doing a tight buoy turn, coming back in, riding those waves in, doing another buoy turn and paddling back out. It's a really fun, dynamic, exciting and really visual side of our sport that's great to watch. And in the past, the top SUP racers were using the All-Star for that event, but now with this new Gen R, the way it's designed, of which I'm going to speak about in a minute, it's so much better for that type of racing. But not only is it better for that type of racing, it's actually going to be better for more open all-water paddling, potentially not as rough as the All-Star. Bit of a hint there. So it is going to suit more than just your surf racing. Now there's loads of great videos online and definitely it's worth watching all of that information as well. But the way that I'm going to drill into this video is I'm really going to talk about the nose shapes all together, the outline shapes all together, the tail shapes all together, talk about how they change and what change those will give you on the water. And then talk about, paddling conditions, what it's like to paddle, glide, tracking speed, turning, stability, all that sort of stuff. And finishing off at the end of the video, really giving you an idea of what rider should be buying what board and what sort of conditions you should be using that board in. Now remember, this isn't a full-blown standalone review of each board, so I'm not going to jump into prices, constructions, different specification sizes available. There's loads of information online on the Starboard website, for example, where you can get all of that. I'm actually going to be driving into really the comparison between these three boards and the differences of them. But the boards that we are using are all as close to size as we can get. So they are 14 foot long and around 25 inches wide. The Sprint is a 25.5 inch wide. The Gen R is a 25 inch wide and the All-Star is a 24.5 inch wide. So let's jump into it. What should we talk about first? Let's start off with outline shape. Up on the screen there you can see you've got the Sprint, the Gen R in the middle and the All-Star on the right hand side. The Sprint is the one that looks very different from the other two. It's got much more of a pulled in nose and it's much thinner further up at that nose as well, so it's got less width at the shoulders, even though at the widest point it is actually the widest board that we have been using. And as it pulls back towards the tail, it's still got a little bit more width compared to the other two boards. Looking at the Gen R and the All-Star, they have a fairly similar outline for most of the board. The All-Star has a little bit more of a pulled in tail shape at the back of the board. The pulled in tail shape will help it turn a little bit more in those choppy or surfing conditions, but the Gen R has that slightly squarer tail, which actually will give it a little bit more stability overall as well. So now let me come a bit closer to you and talk about nose shape. Now, the reason I'm coming straight off of outline template and now looking at nose shape is because they are closely linked, obviously. The Sprint, with that much more slender nose looking down on it, has a way more of a wave piercing characteristics compared to the other two. So really going to hold its waterline length, the full waterline length in the board. So when you're paddling that board, that water is going to be sitting halfway up that nose, always going to be in the water, and it's going to be cutting as smoothly as possible when you are paddling. Now the Gen R is a bit of a compromise between the All-Star and the Sprint. The nose is, looking at the outline template again, down is about the same width as the All-Star, but looking at the cross section of the nose, it has much more of a nose shape like the Sprint. So it's still designed to sit in the water, so the nose is still designed to cut the water, but not as much as the Sprint. So moving that on to the All-Star has a much more raised nose underneath, so less of the nose is touching the water. In effect, that's reducing the overall length of the board. Now, the more waterline length you have on the water, so if you have a 14-foot board and all that 14-foot board is touching the water, it is going to be faster than a shorter board. We've done lots of really interesting videos on that. Definitely, if you're a SUPboarder Pro member, check out the SUPboarder Pro chat with when I talked to Harry, the naval architect, about board length and why it makes such a difference. That's really interesting. So the All-Star has much more of a rounded bottom on the nose. It isn't designed to hold or sit in the water 100% of the time. If we naturally move this conversation onto rocker line, which is the shape of the board underneath, you'll see that the rocker on the All-Star is a little bit higher. So the Gen R is quite flat towards the nose, the Sprint is very flat towards the nose, and the All-Star has a little bit more of a kick towards the nose. So the waterline length on the All-Star is under 14 foot. Waterline length on the Gen R is just under 14 foot, if not is 14 foot, and the Sprint is using the full 14 foot of the board from the nose to the tail. So talking about the tail and the rocker line shape again, keeping a look at that, you'll see that the Sprint is flatter, so there's going to be more of that in the water, and the All-Star and the Gen R are very similar. It's hard to see if maybe the All-Star has a tiny bit more of a kick right at the end of the tail rocker there. Tail rocker is going to help you in those bumpier, rougher conditions. So if you're moving back on the board, the nose of the board is going to lift up. It's going to stop the board from nose diving. Hence why the Gen R and the All-Star are designed for choppy, moving, bumpy water, and the Sprint really isn't designed for that. Now the next subject, which is rail shape, and I think this is probably the most important design aspect, I think, that really goes into these three boards and definitely goes into the All-Star and the Gen R and makes a big difference when you're paddling it. Now, there's two sort of things I want to talk about here. One is the rail thickness and one is the actual bevel or the angle of how the rail meets then to the bottom of the board. First off, talking about the thicknesses, you'll see that there's big differences here between the thicknesses of the board. The Gen R is quite obviously not as thick overall as the All-Star and the Sprint. Now, a thickness on a rail is going to give you a greater amount of secondary stability. Again, another great video we've done with Harry on SUPboarder Pro about this. Secondary stability is that the bigger rail you have, the more that the ball rolls onto the side of the rail, then the secondary stability is going to give you a bit more stability at that point. So your primary stability when you're just rocking from side to side on the flat bottom of the board in effect, and as soon as you roll over and that rail initiates, that's the secondary stability coming in. The Sprint and the All-Star, better secondary stability, but the Gen R not as good because the rail isn't so thick. But you'll probably feel that initially when you're paddling, the Gen R has a slightly more stable feel or better primary stability compared to the other two boards. And that's mainly to do with the bottom shape, which we haven't spoken about yet, which is where the Gen R has a flatter bottom shape. So the board just sits on the water and it's pretty flat. But the All-Star has a bit more V in the bottom, so it wants to roll from side to side. And the Sprint is a bit of a combination between the both. There's a little bit of a V up at the nose, but in the middle of the board, it flattens off a little bit, but it still is quite a big rolled rail. Now looking at the rail shape, which is like the curve of the angle from the sides to the bottom, how that joins itself. Now these boards all have slightly different rail shapes at different points on the board, and Starboard definitely designed their boards to release the water in the fastest way as possible for which board, you know, they're looking to achieve the best performance in whatever water conditions it is. So the Sprint is definitely a slightly more softer rail at the back of the board. It's not worried about having to work of trimming off the tail and turning like riding a bump, because a sharper rail will give you a bit more of a direct turning ability, so you better lean and the board will turn from right and to left, which is why surfboards will have sharp rails at the back of the board. Having a look at the All-Star and the Gen R, they're fairly similar, but the Gen R has got a slightly sharper rail shape at the tail there, which will help a lot more when it comes to riding the board off the tail and surfing. But really, the bit I want to draw you into is big difference between how the rails react to the bottom shape up in the last meter up towards the nose of the board between the Gen R and the All-Star. So the All-Star has a much more softer rail and it approaches into its rocker line much smoother. So what I mean is when you're looking down the board, you're going to see that there's more of an edge on the Gen R further up towards the nose, but the All-Star definitely softens up as it rolls up into its rocker line. Now it's getting a bit complicated maybe for some of you, but bear that in mind, because when it comes to using it on rougher conditions, that is what makes all the difference right there at the front of the board. So just park that in the back of your brain for a minute and we'll bring it back in a second. Last performance bit that changes between these three boards that I'm going to speak about is the deck standing tray area. So recessed decks, the Sprint and the All-Star, compared to not so much of a recessed deck with the Gen R. The benefit of a recessed deck is you're sitting lower in the water. You're not sitting, you're standing lower in the water. If you were standing in the water, below the water, it's really, really stable. It's going to give you the most stable feel, but obviously you can't really do that with a paddleboard. But with the Sprint and the All-Star, you're not far off the water level, so you are keeping a fairly stable feel. The negative or the downside to having a recessed deck is when it comes to maneuvering yourself around the board, as in walking up towards the tail. I say the word up towards the tail because you are actually going to have to climb out of those boards. You have to climb out of those recessed decks, opposed to the Gen R. It's got a very slight recessed deck, and it is slightly recessed obviously compared to the back of the board. But when it goes to moving around the board, doing step back turns or riding a wave, which is what you'd be doing in a technical surf environment, you've got a lot less of a hill to climb. So it's a flatter board in general. And of course, a board with a less dugout is going to be a lot easier to beach start, hence why they've designed this for technical beach start racing. And also for us paddlers who are not doing beach starts, just climbing back on the board is a lot easier with a less dugout board. So that's the thing to bear in mind with recessed decks. The amazing thing that Starboard have done with the recessed decks and the high rails is how they have sort of dug out the sides of the rails to give you an even more stable feel when you're paddling. Now, bit of a fun fact, these boards, okay, so you've got the Sprint at 25.5 and you've got the All-Star at 24.5 and the Gen R at 25. So you would think that the Sprint would have the widest standing position. So you could get your feet out to the sides and they would be the widest. Well, actually it's not. The board that has the widest standing position out of these three is actually the narrowest board. So the All-Star at 24.5 wide has a standing sort of position. You can get your feet as far as possible at about 23.25 inches wide, opposed to the Sprint, which is at 22.25 inches wide. So it's a board that's an inch wider, but you've got an inch narrower width to stand. So it just shows you how they've dug the side of the All-Star out to give you that extra stability. The Gen R sits about the same as the Sprint at about 22.25. Now that is another really interesting fact showing you how Starboard are making the All-Star feel really stable. With the sort of recessed deck and the sort of ability to put your feet to the side, all of these boards you can wedge your feet to the side. Even the Gen R's got enough of a tray that you can get your feet to the edge there without a problem. So, bringing all that together, what does all that mean on the water? How are you going to feel it changes your paddling when you're paddling in different conditions? So, let's look at the pretty obvious one. Straight away, let's look at stability. So, just to recap, you've probably guessed it, but the super stable, most stable board out of these three is actually the All-Star, because it gives you a huge amount of secondary stability because of those higher rails, the fact you can get your feet nice and wide, and the fact you are lower in the board. Now, that doesn't mean the primary stability is the best between all three. The Gen R gives you amazingly a stable feel on the water, but then it does feel a little bit more twitchy when it gets in bumpier conditions. We'll speak about that in a second. The Sprint is definitely the least stable board out of the three. It's got much more of a rounded rail at the back of the board, and that is going to let the board roll from side to side. It's going to give it great speed when you're paddling fast, but it's not going to give you that sideways stability. Just remember, the Gen R feels better initially, but the All-Star and the Sprint actually have a better secondary stability. So if you're looking at step back turns, you're going to find that you're going to be able to walk to the back of the board with the Gen R very easily because it's got less of a sort of recessed deck, and it's got that planted primary stability. The step back turn for the All-Star, it's a little bit harder because you have to climb out of the board. It's going to have a little bit more of a tentative wobble, but it still has a higher rail, giving you a good amount of secondary stability on the board. The Sprint, similar characteristics to the All-Star again, because you've still got to climb out of the board when doing step back turns, but when you get to the back of the Sprint, the board is a little bit wider, but the rails and the bottom shape is more rounded, and that actually makes the board wobble from side to side. When it comes to general glide, which board is the fastest, which board do you put the paddle stroke in and you move the furthest, it's going to be the Sprint. There's no question about it. It's going to be the Sprint. Flatter rocker line, better wave piercing nose, less width at the shoulders, and it's just going to go and it's going to glide. And that's why that board is the faster board, especially if you're doing longer distance paddling. The Gen R and the All-Star, if you're paddling at a normal pace, a steady pace, you're not really working yourself, possibly the Gen R has more of an edge over the All-Star because you are having more of that waterline length in the board. But if you start to push the power down and really load up your paddle strokes and push a lot more weight onto the front of the board, so now really we're talking about sprinting, paddling quicker, the fastest board at sprinting isn't actually the Sprint, it's actually the All-Star, which is why world titles have been won on the All-Star and not the Sprint when it comes to sprinting, which is a bit of a strange one to think about. But the reason that is because the All-Star has got way more volume up at the nose here. Now this volume at the nose, as soon as you push the nose of the board down, the board pushes you back up instead of sinking, and it drives you forward. So a board like the Sprint especially, way narrower in the nose, it's got less volume up under the nose as well. As you push the nose down, the nose just stays going down and you do go forward, but you're not going to get that instant drive up and away like you are with a board like the All-Star. The Gen R is still a quick board. It's going to be interesting to see what top riders use certain boards for certain races. There might be some people that will use the Gen R in a sprint scenario, but overall the All-Star is still the faster board when it comes to sprinting. But I like to see maybe somebody with a certain paddle technique, it might suit them better. But you're talking top level here at the sport. For most people, you're going to find the All-Star is the faster board when it comes to sprinting. But what about tracking then? There's no point in being able to paddle fast if you can't go in a straight line, is there? So the Sprint is going to be the easiest board to track because it's got the full waterline length, it's got the wave piercing nose sort of keeping you on track, and you're going to paddle in that straight line in flatter water conditions. Between the All-Star and the Gen R, if one is going to paddle slightly straight in the other, in theory with its rockline, board profile and nose setup, the Gen R should be a board that paddles in a straighter line, but I still think the way that they've shaped the rails on the All-Star being slightly sharper, it still paddles pretty well in a straight line as well. So the All-Star and the Gen R are fairly close when it comes to tracking. So there's some points to think about with speed, tracking, turning, but really the stuff that really makes the difference between these three boards is the conditions you're going to use them in. We've used these boards flat water, side wind, downwind, upwind. We've used them in chop, and we've used them in horrific swell, side chop, the stuff you do not want to go paddling in. Now, the three boards, first off, flat water. You can use any board in flat water, but the Sprint is going to be the fastest board because it's got that waterline length. So that's quite obvious. The Sprint falls down when the wind comes up or the chop starts appearing on the water surface. The Sprint has a limitation of about knee high at the most if you know what you're doing. Really, for most people, shin high, okay? Because of a number of things which we've already explained about, the waterline length, the nose sticking in the water, the thickness of the rails, all that sort of stuff really doesn't help the Sprint when it comes to the windy or choppy conditions. So what I want you to do is sort of just park the Sprint now out of this conversation from chop, upwind, downwind and side wind, and we're just going to focus on the Gen R and the All-Star, because that really is where these boards will perform and will differ from each other as well. So paddling into wind, the All-Star, because it has more volume under the board up at the nose and it has more of a raised sort of kick on the last foot of the nose of the board, as you pop over a wave and you come back down the other side, it has less of a slap and more of a pop and pushes you forward, just like if you were sprinting. The Gen R is much flatter, just under by the nose, and it slaps a little bit more. It doesn't nosedive because it still has that wave-piercing nose, but it definitely doesn't have as much of a smoother ride into wind compared to the All-Star. But the Gen R has got something really great going for it compared to the All-Star, and that is you've got less freeboard, you've got less thickness of this nose, and that nose isn't going to get affected by the wind so much. Now, when you're punching directly into wind, it's not a massive problem, but if you start turning off the wind or side, just on sort of side wind, let's say, the All-Star does start to feel a little bit more of a handful. You are going to start to feel the effect of that wind on the side of the board because you've got more thickness in the rails, you've got more volume up at the nose, and the Gen R is that more thinned down feeling. So the wind is going to have less windage on the board. Yes, the All-Star will still be paddling itself into that chop nicely, but the wind will be affecting that board at that point. But then the stability of the board and the secondary stability comes in as you start to wobble from side to side. Your legs are going to start to feel you're on the Gen R before your legs are feeling I'm starting to wobble on the All-Star. The All-Star has that more comfortable feel because at that point you've got waves sort of coming up around the side of the board and there's chop going everywhere. You're already starting to roll a little bit and you're already starting to initiate that secondary stability, so the All-Star is going to feel more planted at that stage. Now, this was really obvious to see when we had a paddle off a local point where the tide is going out, the wind is coming in, there's backwash off the side. We took GoPro out to try and do some filming, you know, looking at each other, but it was horrific. So myself, I was on the All-Star to start with, Lucy was on the Gen R. I did a little downwind lap, caught some bumps, then we swapped over, and Lucy straight away was like, oh my word, the All-Star is so much more comfortable in choppy and moving waters, and it is so much more comfortable, even though it's a narrower board. And it really is very obvious at that point, when the conditions get horrible, these boards separate themselves out between the two. The Gen R still works, it's still fast, and it still can handle that stuff, but the All-Star, you haven't got to think about what you're doing, you can just paddle and get through it. The Gen R, you've got to work out how to trim it. You've got to keep moving your feet. You've got to play the balance card all the time with your paddle. You've got to be more on it as a paddler. And then if you're transitioning yourself to do a downwind run, which is like when we were doing it, so we were paddling out into wind, we were turning side wind, paddling for a little bit, and then we were initiating down to a downwind run. That again is where there's a big difference between the Gen R and the All-Star. The pickup speed of when you get a bump and catch a wave is comparable between the two. They both catch waves really easy. But if you do not trim yourself back on the Gen R, the front shoulders of the board and how the sort of rails bevel into the nose shape, let's say, because it's a bit sharper, less sort of the All-Star is more rounded, remember, under the nose. The Gen R requires more footwork or more input from you to control that board. The All-Star is just very plug and play. It almost will ride a bump without you actually moving to change your feet. You could just stand there and paddle and go, whoa, I've got a wave, whoa. The nose won't bury, it sort of just keeps on going. The Gen R needs operator input to get the most out of it. Riding the bumps, they're both quick, they're both going to catch waves, they're both really fun, but definitely way more footwork is required with the Gen R. And I think that really moves us on to who will best suit these boards and the conditions you're going to be paddling in. So giving you an overview of the 3 boards. Now, it's probably becoming pretty clear that the Sprint is the flat water board, and I still think if you're into flat water and you're into paddling far and you're into really trying to pick your paddle days and not paddling when it's really choppy, the Sprint is going to be the better board. It's still very easy to use. It's still not really unstable. You could still get on a narrow board and start to understand how the balance and the stability feels, and you're going to be able to paddle the Sprint. Let's move on to the All-Star. The All-Star is what the Starboard say it is their all-water board, but really it's their board that can handle anything you want to throw at it. So when it comes to really choppy conditions, when it comes to flat water conditions, it's still fast, but it's so easy to use in those bumpy, rough conditions. So if you're a rider that really wants to have one board, go paddling every weekend and not worry about looking at the weather forecast, the All-Star is the board to have. It will take on anything you throw at it, okay? The Gen R is a board that sits in the middle. The way I'm going to sum up the Gen R is like this. Without a doubt, this is the better surf technical race board. If you're going to be doing top level surf, buoy turns in and out of the surf, you're going to want to go on the Gen R, okay? It's got the more stability at the tail, it's quick to catch waves, but it requires a good amount of footwork as well. So you're obviously going to be a pretty good paddler, but at the same time, the Gen R is still very easy to use, it's still very fast on flat water, and it's very comfortable in most water conditions. When the Gen R gets technical is when the All-Star is in its element, when it gets rougher and choppier. So if you're a paddler that is not the Sprint, you're not looking for the ultimate flat water, and you're not paddling only when it's really mirror flat, you want to paddle most of the time, but you're not looking to paddle when it's getting really rough and gnarly, then the Gen R could be a really good board to you to look at. You could enter pretty much most races with this board and be very competitive, even if it was really flat water. Maybe you see if you did that with the All-Star, you might be thinking, definitely not going to be as fast as the Sprint or maybe the Gen R, because it's got less of that rocker-line, waterline length overall in the water. But definitely you're going to enjoy paddling it until it gets a certain amount of roughness, and then you're going to be like, actually this is starting to get a bit of a handful. But for many of you out there, you don't go paddling when it's really rough and horrible. Maybe you live inland and you want to go surfing occasionally, catching bumps occasionally, learning to downwind and estuaries. The Gen R is still going to be a really easy board for that. If you were going to have an All-Star as an inland paddler, probably a bit of a waste, so you'd probably be looking more at the Sprint or the Gen R. But if you're a coastal paddler, you could be definitely looking at a Gen R or an All-Star. So these 3 boards really do complement each other, and they do deserve to be in the Starboard range. They are very different, and I think understanding your paddling ability, but really the conditions you want to paddle in, is key to understanding which board is right for you. I'm really interested to start watching the racing now from the racers to see if they pick up on the Gen R and see what races they take the Gen R out in. Now, it's been really interesting using these 3 boards. I've really loved getting into these different board shapes. There is a massive difference between the 3. I know that there's going to be lots of questions and maybe things I haven't answered in this video, so please let us know in the comments and get your comments below. If you've also used some of these boards or owned these boards already, I'd love to know what they've been like for you, maybe after a couple months of use. Hearing your feedback really does make a difference. So thank you very much, and we'll see you on another video soon.